Coming out tonight, as Ms. Jim introduced me, I'm Chelsea Carlson, and I'm researching women in politics in Korea this year. My interest in this topic originally arose because I wrote my senior thesis on one of the Republic of Korea's first women politicians, Im Young-shin, and her role in the formation of the early Republic of Korean state. I also had some research experience working on the Republican Party's recruitment of women candidates after 2008 for regular election. So my Fulbright project blends those two skills and those two interests. Before I jump into my material, I want to say a quick thank you to Ihwa, and particularly my advisor, Amy Kim, who was here tonight, for all the resources that I have been given. It simply wouldn't be possible to have completed my project. And I also want to say thank you to Sanjay Kim of Harvard University, who helped me get ethics review for this project from Harvard, even though I'd already graduated. So I'm really indebted to those two people in the completion of this project. When I was writing my proposal for Fulbright, I developed this interest in politics, and I started looking through the profiles of the women in the National Assembly. And what I noticed as a general trend is that many of them had arrived in the National Assembly with little or no prior experience in politics. And I started wondering about how that might be the case. So I thought it might be networking, and that's how I arrived at this sort of networking topic. The objectives I outlined in my proposal, and they've sort of changed, but these are the objectives I have with my project. I wanted to identify first the barriers to Korean women's entry into politics. There are many of them. I chose to focus specifically on networking just for my own sanity's sake. Second, I wanted to explore the role of networks in individual careers, how they might limit you or how they might create opportunities for you based on the people that you know. I also, perhaps most importantly, wanted to compare those networks on the basis of gender and location. Can we assume that women and men, the kinds of networks that men and women have as politicians are different? Or are they the same? Additionally, is the experience for politicians different at the national and local level, and do they know different people? And finally, I wanted to articulate the effect of those gender differences in networking and how those manifest in certain areas of Korean politics. So like any good academic does, I went through and surveyed the previous research, and I noticed four primary trends in the kinds of sort of research that people are doing in Korea. First is a lot of scholars will write on the differences between women elected to one National Assembly or another, and try and see if there's any sort of longitudinal change in the kinds of people that parties choose to be in politics. Second is the gender quota's impact on the growth of women's representation in the National Assembly and whether it is effective legislation. Third is an exploration of National Assembly women politicians' legislative initiatives and whether those initiatives are different from those of men. And finally, they will analyze successful women in national politics and the kinds of personal characteristics that they have, including their mannerisms, their education, and things like that. I noticed four major problems in this research that I wanted to use to inform how I constructed my study. So first is that there's a lot of focus on the national level at the expense of the local level. There's very little understanding of how the two levels communicate with one another and how local politicians might influence the national level. So I wanted to be sure I included local politicians in my study. Additionally, there was no comparison between the genders, so there was no real data to help us decide whether women are different from men or whether women are successful because their networks are the same. Third, this is a problem in Korea as it is in political science research anywhere in the world right now, is that there was too much focus on numbers at the expense of narrative experience. Feminist scholars particularly criticize political scientists for this problem because women have such small numbers, they tend to be underrepresented in statistical studies, and therefore their experience gets disguised by the numbers. So they call for researchers to start collecting narrative and qualitative evidence of women's careers so we can create better surveys in the future. And finally, there's very little investigation of party nomination processes and institutions in Korea, and specifically how they impact the candidate's experience. Part of this is because the gongchan, or the nomination process, it's pretty subject to the certain political winds and what parties want to get out of a particular election, so it changes a lot. However, just because it changes a lot, I think it needs to be deeply studied and understood. So these considerations inform my methodology, and I chose to do an interview survey of a small number of men and women regarding their careers in politics. So my sample is divided evenly between national and local level officials, so 15 national level officials and 15 local officials. I've included more women than men because I think women's experiences are generally underrepresented in research. And wanted to emphasize their experience and then use the men as sort of a faux control group against which to compare the women. The local politicians I interviewed were sampled from Seoul City Council, although that's only one person. I wanted to stay outside of Seoul as much as possible. In addition to Gangneung City Council, Wonju City Council, and Gangwon Provincial Council. Those are all in the province just next door to Seoul, if you're not sure where they are. My participants were recruited through a combination of cold calling and some pretty aggressive networking on my part. I definitely used my own Harvard connections to sort of get an initial introduction, especially to national level politicians who are very busy and may be quick to dismiss me as a journalist. They're very suspicious of me. And then from there, I would ask all my participants to refer me to at least one other person that they thought would be good to involve in my study. So that's how I got most of my participants. I tried to sample as evenly as possible from both parties, but because Saint-Louis is the majority conservative party, they are the ones most represented in my study. So I have 17 people that represent the Saint-Louis party versus 10 from Minju, or now New Politics Alliance for Democracy. And the remaining 2 people out of the 29 that I've interviewed so far were women and members of third parties that were eventually absorbed by Saint-Louis. My interviews took about 45 minutes. I would ask them about mentorship, basically who they know, who helped them get into politics, who continues to support them professionally, their educational background, the forms of party support that they may or may not have received, and this includes sort of financial support as well as networking or even training support. And their stories about how they got into politics, who recruited them, and what happened after they were recruited. In addition to my interview survey with politicians, I also interviewed members of the Supreme Committees of Parties, which are the governing committees for political parties in Korea, and interviews with the Gongchan Committee, some people that have served on Gongchan committees, in order to get a better understanding of how the nomination process works from both sides of the equation. I do have to say that some of my interviews in the study with the politicians did double duty and had served on Gongchan committees in the past, and I also interviewed them about that experience. The reason for that is that serving on a committee is a really good way to show party loyalty, and it also means that the party has recognized you for your achievements as a professional. So that's basically the format of my study. It's not super complicated. A lot of networking studies involve very complicated statistics and beautiful models with, people as points and spiderweb-looking things. But I just wanted to sort of create a narrative basis that could inform those kinds of studies in the future. So before I get into sort of the meat of my results, I think it might be useful, if you don't know a lot about Korean politics, to get a little bit of Korean Politics 101 so you're not deeply confused with the rest of my presentation. So first I'll go through the structure of the National Assembly, in addition to the structure of local assemblies and historical background of basically how local government came to be, because it's actually a fairly recent phenomenon in South Korea. And then finally I'll cover the relevant gender quota regulations that help inform the structure of the nomination process. I'll cover the nomination process itself and how it's structured later in my presentation, because it's as part of my results. So first, the National Assembly. Korea uses a parliamentary system in which the president is allowed to initiate legislation. The National Assembly consists of 300 seats. 246 of them are directly elected single-member districts. The remaining 54 seats comprise a single multi-member national district of proportional representatives. This section of the National Assembly was created in 2004, although it was sort of the product of a number of laws that were instituted over the course of the 1990s. Seats in the proportional representative section of the National Assembly are appointed solely through the parties. They are not elected by voters. This section is also governed by gender quota laws. 50% of proportional representatives must be women. And additionally, proportional representatives may not serve more than one term. If they want to come back, they have to get elected. Members of the National Assembly serve 4-year terms, and we're currently in the 19th National Assembly. At the moment, women constitute a little less than 16% of National Assembly MPs, and most of them are appointed proportional representatives. Elected women representatives only represent about 8% of the total National Assembly. So the local government separated from the national administration in 1991 with the Local Autonomy Act. There was a brief period where local government, like city council and the mayors, were responsible for creating budgets for their areas and carrying out those budgets. But that was, they were reabsorbed back into the government, I think, in the 1960s. The first full-fledged local elections were held only in 1995. So local elected positions are actually quite new. The elected positions in local government are city council, city mayor, provincial council, and provincial governor, vice mayoral positions of major cities, and vice gubernatorial positions at the provincial level are still appointed by the president. Korean political parties were actually outlawed from participating in the local election nomination process until 2005. I haven't done enough reading to understand exactly why they were allowed to start participating in local elections again in 2005, but I have a feeling that it had something to do with the reintroduction of the proportional representation system at the local level in 2006, which does necessitate some level of party involvement because you need somebody to create ordered candidate list and choose who gets to be an appointed proportional representative. So at the local level, there's a 10% of the seats in a city or provincial council are set aside as proportional representative seats, and half of those must go to women as well. Korea has a rather complex system of gender quotas. Although it's interesting in that most of those gender quotas regard the nomination process rather than enacting certain regulations on the National Assembly itself. It's actually pretty ingenious in my opinion, but anyway, to give you some basic background, candidates for regular election at the national level, 30% of them must be, 30% of the party's nominees must be women. And the government gives a financial reward to parties that exceed that minimum quota to encourage them to nominate more women. Minjidang actually has nominated over the quota in the past. In the 2012 election, they nominated 40% of their candidates were women. So it does happen. At the provincial level, 10% of party regular election nominees must be women. And women must occupy the first spot on the ordered candidate list for proportional representatives. And then to explain that, so a woman is at the top, then a man is second, woman third, man fourth, and those lists alternate by gender. And the reason they have a woman occupy the first spot is because it makes it more likely that there will be a greater number of women than men. And it ensures that women get priority in the selection process. And proportional representatives are simple. You have to have 50% women. If a party submits a list that doesn't follow these regulations, then that list is rejected entirely by the National Election Commission, and the parties are put behind in the election process against their competing parties. So there's a very strong incentive for political parties to obey these laws. So now that we've had that primer in Korean politics, I hope I covered enough. I want to sort of get into the meat of the results of my research. So I'll go through and explain this image piece by piece. But basically, if you wanted to draw a picture of the drivers of women's representation, you would start out with networking as your base, which influences the Kongcho, which ultimately influences the number and kinds of women that end up in, say, a local assembly or even the National Assembly. So each part cannot be separated from the other. You can't really talk about networking in isolation because people are networking in order to do better in the Kongcho. So that's why this picture looks the way it does. Korea's system of candidate nomination is highly centralized and controlled by the major parties in Seoul. And networking is sort of both a cause and an effect of the Kongcho structure. So keep this image in mind as I go through the rest of my presentation. So this is a very simplified chart that generally summarizes the sort of results that I got when I asked the people in my study about the people that they know in politics, who got them there, and who they consider to be important connections to them. So the basic point is that men just have no more people and therefore have more resources to pursue what they want in politics. Additionally, their networks empower them to actively pursue politics rather than merely wait for party recognition, as women do often in my study. So, particularly important among men at all levels of politics are education networks, even stretching as far back as middle school. Some of my interviewees were really upset that I didn't ask them where they went to middle school. I draw the line at high school, and they're like, no, I have friends in middle school, they're important. So, so that was kind of an interesting discovery that basically these networks are very, very old, and they're very, very solidified. Do you know what the sanbe-hube relationship means? If you don't, raise your hand. Well, that was bad. I shouldn't have done that. But just a brief explanation is, so I graduated from Harvard College in 2013. Somebody that graduated in 2010 would be my sanbe, or my senior, and somebody that graduated in 2014 would be my hube, or my junior. And these kinds of relationships are very important, and they're a source of really good friendships for most Korean students. Especially since people tend to attend single-sex high schools, they become very important even as you move out into your career. Among men, these kind of sanbe-hube relationships are very formalized in that the groups of men will meet often in very casual settings to drink together, to eat, and to talk casually about their careers and their aspirations as well as other aspects of their life. Since education networks also among men tend to be much more established and are much more likely to transcend geographic location, these networks also present a number of opportunities for men to gain advice, resources, and even connections in high places, regardless of their personal location, either in Korean politics or on the Korean peninsula. Local men are at a slight disadvantage compared to national level men because they tend to have stayed local for high school and college, even their graduate education. So they will attend, say, a provincial level college instead of a major prestigious university in Seoul, which automatically restricts the kinds of networks that they have as going into their professional lives. Men serving at the national level tend to have attended elite universities in Seoul, which gets them into the power structure early in their professional careers, which gives them a huge advantage if they consider politics later in life. When you look at women, it becomes clear that women just have too much to make up for in comparison to getting connections like they have with men. They just have fewer to go on. At the local level, family and school connections tend to be important. Family, in this case, should be, I have to sort of redefine that. It's not, when I say family connections are important, it's not that their, say, father or a close relative has held a prior political office. It was actually extremely rare for anybody in my study to have had a close relative in politics. What it means is that they use, say, their father's professional connections or a spouse's professional connections to sort of network closer to the parties or to start pursuing a political career. or even just to get their name out there so that they get noticed by the parties instead of being so active about it. School is also bracketed in both local and national level politics because while these sort of school-based networks exist among women, they're not using them in the same way that men use them. Men use their school networks to get where they want to go. They use it to get into politics, to get resources, to get names. Whereas women politicians tend to use it once they're already in office as a means of support and as a means of sort of finding other professionals to consult with on policy. So that's really the biggest difference in how they use their school networks. It's not that alumni networks don't exist among women, and they in fact can be quite strong. The number of equal women in the National Assembly is a testament to that fact. Additionally, when I went to Gangneung, one of my interviewees took me to lunch with one of her hubeis, who was in her 30s, that they were talking about politics and wanted me to hear that conversation. But they're using them only as sort of advising, but they're not using them as a source for party resources. For women at the national level, they tend to get into politics through using their professional connections and by distinguishing themselves as environmentalists, as women's organization leaders, as professionals. And then that's what gets them recognized by the parties. A very typical path for a woman into national level politics is to spend a number of years cultivating an image or a reputation in a particular field, and then be approached by the party just sort of out of the blue and all of a sudden for a particular election. Only 3 of the women that I talked to in my study at either level began their careers with an eye towards politics. Politics was, to sort of create an image for you, was something they fell into. It's not something they actively pursued. Additionally, only 2 women at the local level had any ambition for a national level seat. All but one of the men, by comparison, had, at the local level, wanted to win a seat in the National Assembly. So these networks are extremely important in how people sort of envision their careers going and whether they'll be ambitious about pursuing a career in politics. A final point is that the closer you are to Seoul and the closer you can get to that power network, the better you will do in politics regardless of your gender. Seoul is the center of power. You've got to get closer to it if you want to be even remotely successful. That said, the ultimate trump card isn't knowing a Korean president or a Korean presidential candidate. Korean politics has often been referred to as the politics of the vortex. There's actually a book published in the 1960s on presidential power that uses this title. And it's still true today. If you know a Korean president or a Korean presidential candidate, they can act as a quote-unquote guardian angel that helps you overcome any sort of lack of networking connections or any biases that may be working against you in the political party or in Korean politics in general. Just to give a quick anecdote, I interviewed he's a current proportional representative in the National Assembly for Saint-Louis, which is the conservative majority party. And he'd been a economics professor for a number of years and had distinguished himself and had worked with the government advising some of their economic policies. And he was approached by Saint-Louis to apply for the proportional representative and strongly encouraged to do so. He felt like this was kind of out of the blue, but applied anyway and got into the National Assembly. He found out who the committee members were that nominated him and he asked one of the members, well, why did you nominate me? Well, the story that he was told, there's reason to suspect whether it's believable or not, is that Park Geun-hye, when she was sort of thinking about organizing the National Assembly that she wanted to see, called the previous president, Lee Myung-bak, and asked for 4 recommendations for the proportional representatives. 3 of the recommendations from Lee Myung-bak had to be women, and 1 had to be a man. And my interviewee was the man that he said should be nominated. So, as a result, he was sort of angeled and brought over into Korean politics, even though he didn't really have prior interest and wouldn't have even thought about applying. Additionally, there was a female interviewee. She was a rather prominent candidate for mayor in Seoul, and she was up for bid in the Kongcho for an elected seat. a proportional representative seat. And one of the committee members for the proportional representative committee really disliked her. And she fought and fought and fought to try and get higher up the list. And finally, Amy Bach called the committee member on her behalf and said, we have to have her. And she was moved 10 spots up the list immediately. So it's a really important thing to know a Korean presidential candidate. It's the best thing you can do for yourself as a candidate in politics with any kind of national aspiration. So let me get to the Kongcho process. In the United States, we have a system where basically candidates get nominated by going through a primary, which is sort of a test election to see who voters like. And then parties will typically endorse the person who wins the primary or the most primaries. It's efficient. They avoid spending money before they have to. Korea sort of runs this process in reverse, and they sort of engineer the kind of candidates that they want to produce to the public. There's nothing wrong with that process, it's just different. This process, doing a party committee-based system is not particularly unique to Korea, although the way that Korea runs it is unique. Political parties in Israel, Mexico, and England also run sort of similar systems. So this is not an unheard of kind of process. The process changes often, and what parties seek to convey by using the Kongcho process and how they appoint people that serve on these Kongcho are sort of democratic forms, that they are supporters of democracy, even though that they're using what is fundamentally a very closed and centralized process that's almost completely taken away from voters. And because of the way the Kongcho runs and the way they score candidates' application, networking is really your best defense against any sort of biases that you might see. I won't go through all of the steps for this because it's not particularly interesting. But basically, people apply. The committees evaluate them using their personal statement. They have to say candidates have to say why they want to be a politician. They interview them. They also, if a particular candidate is a finalist and there are 2 or more finalists in a particular district, they have them go through the usual process of campaigning. And they'll also distribute a public poll at the same time to try and get a handle on who voters like. After they've evaluated all of these points, sorry, didn't mean to go that far, they will then choose a particular candidate to endorse. However, even that is subject to negotiation with the party's Supreme Committee or the 5 or 6 people at the top. And the Supreme Committee retains the power to knock somebody out of the running at any point, to change them into a different district, to move them up or down the list, or really do anything that they see will create a better strategy and a greater likelihood of the party winning more seats in the next election. So it can cause a lot of frustration both with candidates and the members of the Kongcho Committee. Just to give you a sense of the scoring, in the application, the possibility of winning an election is 30% and the greatest component of your entire score. It's unclear how they define the possibility of winning an election, and actually this is where most women candidates lose out. I interviewed one of the Supreme Chairmen of Minjugang, and I asked him just straight up, where do women lose out in this process? And he said they just don't have the kind of reputation you would need to win an election. So when parties go to evaluate candidates, they are actually taking your network into account in the sense that, how out there is your name? How many people know you? Because that's how you get elected. It's sort of a one-to-one relationship where the person who, more people know is probably the better investment of party funds and party efforts. Second, they want to make sure you're loyal to the party. You're not flip-flopping parties just, to be opportunistic. And that can cause some women a lot of problems. One of my interviewees was worried about her upcoming election because she has switched back and forth in the past, and that can really harm you. Your performance in a committee interview, as well as public opinion survey results, and evaluation from your peers in the National Assembly if you're seeking re-election, can be really important factors in deciding who the candidate is. And additionally, there's a system of bonus points. In the scoring, an additional 10% is awarded to women, just for being women. Additional points go to people that have a lack of prior political experience, as well as first-time applicants. So they really want new blood. It helps the party portray itself as more democratic and not corrupt because they're bringing in new blood. They want to get away from this idea of political line and political dynasty. Additionally, parties, depending on the election, can institute special regulations. One constant is the proportional representation seats. You always need 50% women for those. But like St. Nudidam has done this year for the local elections, is they have introduced special women-only districts. There's 3 of them in the entire nation where only a woman can win that seat. They won't even consider men who apply. Additionally, we still have the regulation that women must be the first name on local council election lists. And this may not even be a comprehensive list of the kinds of benefits that you can get as a female candidate, but this is what has come up in my interviews. Just to talk quickly about the committee structure, the committees that nominate candidates for regular election are separate from the proportional representative evaluation committee. So there's 2 committees for any given national election for the National Assembly. Both committees consist of 15 people. Those 15 people are roughly split between current National Assembly members. So a lot of my interviews call them party members, but they're more than just regular party members. And party loyal professionals in Seoul. So they'll pick people in economics and agriculture or prominent professors to try and display sort of a sense of fairness and that they're bringing a lot of expertise together to evaluate whether someone is qualified for a particular position. For local elections, it's a little bit more extensive just because there's more people running. So underneath the Supreme Committee, you have a secondary supervisory committee, which then sort of oversees these committees here, which actually choose the candidates. The supervisory committee is there just to sort of keep the peace and resolve any conflicts that any committees at the local level might have in deciding on candidates. If the supervisory committee can't figure it out, the Supreme Committee is sort of the final level of appeal. And they also then have power over all these other committees at the bottom to finally choose the candidates. And there's a lot of negotiation during this process. So basically, the summary point with this whole Gongcheon part of the presentation is that when you're looking at it as a candidate, you can't be very sure about your chances with the Gongcheon. So how do you arm yourself about, with the bias against women in the 30% sort of possibility of winning election points if you know, like, oh, well, I'm not that well known, but I think I'm qualified. How can I sort of make myself do better in this process? Additionally, local politicians also encounter a number of obstacles when they go to rise through political office, and there is sort of a consistent anti-local bias among party members and in the Korean government. So I went to talk to a professor of Korean politics and Gongcheon member for St. Nudidam, and she referred to a common perception among Korean politicians is that local politics is kiddie politics, is not real politics. And it's a place where you put people that have a heart for politics, but not necessarily the ambition or ability to make them serious candidates for the national level. Even people that a party considers a qualified candidate for a particular post, if they're too qualified, they actually reject the application for a local position and say, we want you to wait until the next national election because we think you'd be a great candidate and this is a waste of your talent. So there's a pretty explicit anti-local bias that is working against local politicians that have any kind of national ambition. Additionally, experience in local politics is still prior experience in politics. And because of Korea's unique sort of democratic environment, there's a general awareness of people that are sort of in the political machine. It sort of smacks of corruption to voters. So parties try as much as they can to get sort of clean blood. This works disproportionately against female candidates too, who tend to, and because they're women, they tend to have a reputation as clean politicians. They're not corrupt, which may or may not be true. So there's also that bias working against them. The anti-local bias may be also a consequence of delayed involvement in local elections. They simply don't have the infrastructure and they don't have a history of cultivating candidates at the local level and funding them. It was a common answer among my local interviewees when I asked them, like, okay, what support did you get from the party? How did they help you? They said they didn't. The parties really just sort of operate a nomination, they serve a nomination function to sort of make it more efficient for candidate registration for the government, and that's about it. They don't really get involved in local politics. However, there are gender differences of the anti-local bias. Like I said, all but one of the local men in my studies said that they wanted to go to the national level. And when I asked them how they might imagine conducting that campaign, they said, okay, I have to get to know a National Assembly member, and I have to make sure I get in touch with the party. But they never said that, they never viewed it as sort of an impossible task. They were like, I know somebody in the Blue House, I know somebody in the National Assembly, I can do this. Whereas women were unlikely to articulate that or even hypothesize about how you might run that campaign when I asked them to. And local politicians in general don't seem to perceive that there is this bias working against them at the national level, even though, like, time and time again it shows that the parties don't pick local politicians for national level positions. So political parties, by default, are sort of shrinking the candidate nominee pool, and they're sort of self-restricting, I think, possibly very qualified people that really know where they're coming from and would be really great at the national level because they have experience negotiating, they know their population well. So, I mean, that's really my biggest problem with the anti-local bias. So, in summary, where do women lose the political game? Like I said, with networking, they have fewer resources than men. Single-sex school alumni networks among women are not as powerful, and women use them also in different ways, in less efficient ways than men do if they pursue a national level post. There's also very little networking across genders. People tend to recruit people that they know and that they're comfortable with. That tends to be people of your own gender. So women also lack a lot of significant patterns of endorsement by male candidates that they would need to sort of get into the male world of politics. With the Kongcho, like I said, distance from Seoul and its numerous resources reduces the chances of getting party support at higher levels that would sort of make you immune to any difficulties you might encounter during the nomination process. And it's pretty hard to fight a very centralized candidate nomination system. You're unlikely to change it as one person. Also, additionally, like I said, the way the points are scored makes it hard for women to win just on the pure basis of their networks. That 30% possibility of winning an election is a real sticking point, especially for women. For party support and mentorship, women candidates tend to wait for assurance or a sure indication of party support, usually a direct invitation to join the party and participate in an election before they'll even run. Whereas men will actively seek these out. Even if they sort of slightly entertain the idea of politics, they'll start talking to their friends about how they might make it happen. So because of that, women lack the kind of party support and especially party mentors that you would need to be successful in politics and get the kind of money that you need to run an election. Also, among women, there's a pretty strong belief in prevailing and very limiting wisdom about how women get into politics. It's believed that women must serve as proportional representatives in politics before they can run for an elected seat. It's great because the proportional representative seat allows you to get practice with very minimal risk to yourself as an individual. But by perceiving it as the women's way into politics, but this is how women get into politics, it's also limiting for women that may be qualified and feel ready to go all into a regular election. Women and men also talk about preparing for politics in very different ways. A lot of my interviewees talked about study and what that means. I asked them, like, what advice would you give to someone who wants to go into politics? And they said you have to study a lot. And what men meant when they said study is that you have to study a lot as a politician to make better policy. Women said you have to study a lot to get into politics. You have to study politics politics itself, rather than learning as you get into the job. So that was also very limiting, and that was also wisdom that say women would give to another woman that asked them, like, how do I get into politics? Well, you have to study. You have to make sure you're really ready before you go. Part of this is because they're reacting to how the parties have treated them, and they're sort of imparting conventional wisdom. But it's also very limiting for younger women, especially that may feel ready to just jump into an election. So that is the entirety of my presentation. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. Thank you so much. Okay. Questions?
Elsie, I'm very impressed with all the work that you've done in a relatively short period of time. And I remember the first conversations we had that you were not getting any good leads in the beginning, but I'm very impressed with all the work that you've done. You said that women usually needed to be invited to go into politics vis-a-vis the men. And the other thing that I heard is that women, even after they serve the first term as a proportional candidate, rarely get an invitation to go beyond the first term, except for a very small minority, including the current president. Was that your impression? And if you had dealt with that issue, what do you think were behind those lack of invitation beyond the first term?
Just take this one. So the question was, after women serve as proportional representatives, they're not necessarily invited back by the parties, even though they have experience to run for an elected seat. And yes, that is something that I definitely encountered, and especially in the National Assembly, among the women proportional representatives that I interviewed, I asked them, like, do you want to come back for an elected seat? And a pretty common response was a lack of confidence about party support. So that still continues to be a problem. There were a couple women that had tried and weren't elected. There was even one woman who she got an offer to come back and she turned it down because of her family. She felt that it was just too much work. So yes, that continues to be a problem. I don't know exactly why that is. That's a question I should have asked and didn't think to ask until it was too late with the party leaders. So that's something that I think I would like to research in the future, is how many women get into the proportional representative program and then sort of go on, because that's sort of the role of the proportional representative seats, is that they should create experience for those women to then come back and use it. So that's something that I noticed too. In the back.
You did a great job. Thank you very much. My question pertains to the gender breakdown at the top universities in Seoul, because you mentioned going to a university in Seoul had a huge impact on the network you're able to build and your ability to jump right into politics. So do you know about what the gender ratio is at these schools versus more provincial universities?
Well, the question was what the gender ratio is at universities and how that, if it's different based on location and how that affects bids for political office, or like the kinds of people, those kinds of networks.
You mentioned how important it is.
Yeah. To be honest, I haven't looked into that, and I don't know. I assume now they're pretty close to equal gender ratio, unless there's an explicitly single-sex school like EFOC. Professor Kim, you might be in a better position to answer that one, but that's something I'll look into, and that's definitely worth considering. I really appreciate that question.
Thanks for your presentation. It was so impressive. And my question is that is there any, because you've already interviewed with several women politicians, so I want to, if you know, I want to hear that is there any case that a woman, kind of a woman society that would really influence positively the competition process or not? Like women's combat working, kind of some women groups or gender groups?
You mean like sort of women's organizations that then put up their own members for election? Yes, that happens. One of the proportional representatives I interviewed, that was how she got in, was the president of sort of a women in politics research organization, recommended her to the party because this woman was in a study group, was rather prominent in sort of Seoul society. I won't say the work she does because it kind of gives her away. But she was put up for election, and that actually is a somewhat common way for women to get into politics. It's parties. Basically, what parties seek to do is they seek to create a national assembly that's a collection of sort of professional expertise in different fields, and they consider women's organizations to be sort of a form of expertise on women. And they will work with Korean feminist organizations to sort of recruit from their own kind. So yes, that does happen. It's not the primary way women get into politics, but it does help. Dory.
Thank you for your talk, Chelsea. So this is perfectly related to what you've been talking about, but I'm just curious to hear your opinion about how you think the recent Sewell ferry tragedy will affect the election.
So the question is whether, like, how the Sewell tragedy might impact the upcoming local elections on June 4th. I don't have a totally scholarly opinion on that one, but basically, so there's a lot of regionalism in Korean politics, and sort of the liberal minority party stronghold is in Jeollado, which is close to where the accident happened. They were responsible for the emergency services. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that they might have kind of a negative impact if people perceive that the connection between the sort of lackluster response of the emergency services to the ferry as it was sinking as a problem with Jeolla government. Another way to see it is that, if they're upset with the ruling party, well, maybe the ruling party will suffer a lot of losses this year. As far as women go, I think it could be interesting if women are perceived as more caring and more sort of, that they listen to citizens' needs better. And especially with the Sewell tragedy, I think it might be useful actually for some women's candidates to capitalize on their role as mothers and their sort of care for the nation and how they might have prevented that tragedy. But that would be sort of my basic answer. And I leave June 9th. I'm really excited for June 4th. And I'm glad that I stayed long enough that I can sort of see it play out. Mike?
Great presentation. You mentioned earlier about one of the reasons when they're going through the Kongcho process is that they can't. It's one of the limitations. They don't have any kind of, I don't know what we call marketability or something. The ability to be seen to be attractive to the voters. Mm-hmm. And I was just kind of wondering what are those things that are, because obviously networks, right, are kind of hidden, right, mm-hmm. to a certain degree. And so what are the things that are shown, or what are the things that are seen to be, attractive? Like, I can think of one in the U.S. where you have I made some bill or I did something, but when they're going through this process, what are the kind of features of a candidate that are seen to be attractive, and do candidates actually try to develop any of those things on their own? So
the question was about sort of the possibility of winning the election aspect of the Gongcheon scoring system, and how parties evaluate that point. Is that correct?
What are the things that are seen to have value for candidates beyond their connections?
The basic answer is that I really don't know. Not even really the parties, like the party members that I interviewed could define it in very clear terms. I think they sort of treat it on a candidate per candidate basis. But looking at the kinds of, say, men and women that come out of the Gongcheon process, which is also a very well-researched topic, is that they tend to be professionals that sort of, they write a column in, say, Seoul dailies. They're well endorsed by other people in their profession. Maybe a Gongcheon committee member has worked with them and said, oh, this person's really qualified. That would be sort of my best guesses as to what constitutes being well-networked as an evaluation point, in addition to whether the party has even heard of you before. So, is that a sufficient answer?
Yeah, I guess the issue is just, how does a politician make his or her name prior to their political career?
I mean, just getting introduced to the party so they know who you are when you come to them with your application and your desire to come into politics. In addition, there's some research on Korean voter behavior, and it tends to be somewhat clientelistic in the sense that it's a one-to-one relationship. So if average voters know who you are, then I think parties feel pretty secure about your the likelihood of you winning that election, because they can have a pretty concrete sense of who knows you and how they feel about you in some sense. All right, thank you.